Hey everyone, Steve the Amateur Historian, trying to wake up. I hoisted myself out of bed, snatched a ride downtown, and I don't know if I'm with it yet, but I'm at this intersection behind me. This is Southwest 2nd and Market Street. A lot of, commerce as you'd expect in this area. Keller Auditorium right here, named after Ira Keller, who was a dick, but, those are the people that usually get stuff named after him, unfortunately. But, for our sake, there was a rather grisly death that occurred at an apartment house on this block right behind me. And that's stage set for a new episode of Historic Murders of Portland. So it's December 12th, 1920. A married couple named Jack and Nellie Tevis. They've been married for 2 years. They were living at a rooming house on this block. And I actually found some old pictures back when so much of this had been wiped out. There really wasn't a lot around here because they were tearing a lot of blighted buildings down and expanding and making the city brighter. So a lot of new structures came up, which is why this area looks so new nowadays. But the imagery I found showed essentially there was almost nothing in this area. The Keller Auditorium might have been here, but there was just a couple rooming houses right here, just to the east side of 2nd Avenue along Market. And so I think it's very possible that one of those rooming houses that's closer to this intersection may have very well been the building that Jack and Nellie Tevis lived in 1920. The building was demolished probably in the 50s or 60s, so it was definitely, and it would look pretty worn down by then, it was definitely around in 1920. But as it stands, again, it's December 12th, 1920. Jack Tevis is a chronic alcoholic. It seems like Nellie kind of is too, but Jack is on a whole other level. A lot of guys in this big city back in the day. Jack Tevis was a chronic alcoholic, and it seems he was out early in the day, the morning hours. He was out on a drinking binge, which was probably a regular everyday thing. And around noontime, December 12th, he comes home to the apartment house he's living in with his wife. And actually, I read that when they first married, they lived in the Medford Hotel, which is actually located on the fringe of Chinatown. And at this time, Jack was working in a soda shop at 2nd and Cooch, which is like dead center Chinatown. So a lot of early days of their marriage, they were living way north of here in Chinatown, and they ultimately ended up down here in Southwest kind of PSU neighborhood. At least that's what it is today. Anyway, so Jack Tevis comes in. This is his story. He comes into his home a little after noon, and his wife is on the ground, and she's grasping at her throat, but she's not grasping at her throat like she's, choking on something. She's grasping at her throat in a way that the newspapers describe it as she's trying to pull someone's hands away, like somebody was choking her, and she was trying to pull their hands off of her, so it's just probably like this. And according to Jack Tevis, he finds her in this state, and she says something to the effect of, "Jack, I'm dying." Which how she would necessarily know that, I don't know. It was claimed that both Jack and Nellie the night before were guzzling down moonshine, literal moonshine. So they were probably both pretty wasted drunk going into that following day, so potentially how Nellie Tevis could have any idea what was going on to her is a bit of a question. But again, as the story goes, Jack stumbles out of the room, stumbles downstairs, encounters I think it was the stepson of the proprietor of the rooming house. It says, something's wrong with Nellie, so somebody do something. And And I don't remember exactly how long after this Nellie Tevis actually died, but she did die as a result of strangulation. Their next door neighbor, a guy by the name of Kennedy, who apparently knew them both, knew the couple very well. And of course, in the aftermath of the death, the strangulation death, Jack Tevis said, "Oh, we were a great married couple. We never fought. Everything was perfect." And Kennedy, the guy next door, says they argued a lot. They argued when they were drunk. They argued when they were sober. They had a very, very bitter, hostile fights. I don't know if those fights ever really escalated to anything physical, but it became something he was used to. Kennedy had become so used to it that he said, he was one of the few people that was sort of a witness to this murder, but he heard the screams of Nellie when she was presumably being attacked. And he'd grown so used to hearing Nellie and Jack fighting and squaring off and yelling at each other next door that he literally said he didn't do anything about it. He didn't even get up out of his seat to go check what was going on because that was such a common thing. He literally said he just assumed it was Jack and Nellie fighting again. And he didn't do anything because it was, quote, none of his business. So he just sat there and just kind of chilled while Nellie Tevis was being strangled to death in the next room. But, honestly, there was a lot of, that was most couples. Abusive, drunken husband, a lot of fighting, nobody's happy. So that's kind of, you have a witness, and then you have Jack Tevis' story, which is he comes home, finds his wife drunk, runs and goes for help. Now, reportedly, he immediately put his coat on and, ran out of the apartment house, which is why you would do that while your wife is dying. See, here's the thing that bugs me. Apparently he threw his coat on and said he was going to go get a doctor, go to the hospital and get somebody personally. My problem with that is his wife isn't even dead yet. If his wife says he's dying and if his wife says she's dying and he thinks that that's really going to happen, I understand you running out and yelling, "Help, give me some help, maybe we can save her," but why would you leave the apartment house then if your wife may be on her last limb? Wouldn't you yell at somebody else to go get some help so you can be there by your wife and hopefully she pulls through, but if she does die, you're there with your wife? But no, Jack Tevis puts his coat on, runs out of the building, reportedly to go get help. Doesn't return to the rooming house for 7 hours. It's 7 p.m. by the time he returns home here at 2nd and Market. Nellie is long since dead. He's even more drunk, so it's known that when he left home, he at least spent part of his time probably wandering around saloons. I know there's a bunch of saloons down here back in the day. There was a bunch of saloons down this way. Pretty much everything down this way was just lined with taverns and saloons, so he would have had his choice in terms of where he wanted to sit down and have a drink. So, it's a little suspicious. Jack Tevis has his story, which makes him look like the sad husband who, I guess, figured his wife was going to die, so he went out and got drunk out of depression. But at the same time, nobody can verify that he wasn't the killer. Obviously, when a wife turns up dead, one of the first suspects is the husband. Nobody really sees when Jack Tevis arrives or leaves, or I guess, people saw him leaving, but nobody knows exactly when he got back. And they'd apparently been drinking a lot the night before. They quarreled a lot, even though he claimed they had a perfect marriage, which is a red flag in and of itself. And, he fled the scene. He fled the scene in the immediate aftermath. That's what he did. He said he was going to get help, and he didn't get help. He fled the scene, and then just went and got more drunk. And it's funny, by the time he gets back, and, he's obviously arrested for being incredibly suspicious. And he claims now at this time to pretty much, he was just so slobbering drunk that morning, afternoon, and evening. He doesn't remember anything. He doesn't remember how Nellie came to be in the way she was. But one piece of information he never forgot was when he goes into the room, finds Nellie grasping at her throat, and she makes the statement, Jack, I'm dying, or Jack, help me, I'm dying, something along those lines. So he can't remember a single detail of anything that happens, what he does, but he remembers that specific little detail amidst his blackout drunkenness. And here's the thing is, when you get strangled to death, they choke you until, you go so long without oxygen to the brain that literally everything shuts down, and then you're dead. You don't get strangled and then come around and come out of it oh my god, I got strangled, and then still die afterwards. That's not how strangulation works. You're either going to get strangled long enough to kill you, or strangled not long enough to where you manage to survive and come out of it. And you might be a little worse for wear, but you're going to survive. You're not going to wake up and be like, oh God, I'm dying, and then you just suddenly die afterwards. So even Jack's story of the husband coming home and like, oh no, I found my wife and she's dying, somebody help me. It doesn't hold any water at all, because that's not how strangulations work. I obviously don't have a lot of personal experience, but I know either you get strangled and you die, or you're strangled and you don't. You don't get strangled, pull through, and then just suddenly die. It doesn't work that way. So it's definitely suspicious. In the case of Jack Tevis, his whole story was just ridiculous, and, you know, the only part of his story I honestly believe is that he was drunk the whole time that this was going on. So he's arrested. He's charged, understandably, in my opinion, with first-degree murder, because, you know, he can't prove he wasn't there. We have no other suspects. Nobody else really has any reason to kill his wife. You know, he's known to be full of crap when it comes to the idea that him and his wife never fight, they had a perfect marriage, you know, blah, blah, blah. And his story was just ridiculous. And then, of course, he conveniently gets drunken amnesia the moment, you know, the police start talking to him and harping on him. All of a sudden, he can't remember anything. How convenient. So, yeah. Jack Tevis didn't do himself any favors, and it seemed pretty clear to authorities by this moment that something happened. His wife pissed him off. He went into a drunken rage. He just lost his mind and attacked his wife. And again, probably in the rooming house, one of these old rooming houses that was located right here along Market between 1st and 2nd Street, but closer to 2nd Street. Then we fast forward 2 days after the murder. It's December 14th, 1920, and there's a coroner's inquest had on Nellie Tevis, because we're still not 100% sure exactly what happened. And this ends up being very beneficial to her husband Jack, in that her body is analyzed by the coroner, and they actually deem that she died as a result of she had a fractured skull that caused a brain hemorrhage, and that's actually what killed her. Which almost then lends a little credence suddenly to Jack's story, because again, a second ago I was talking about how, like, you don't get, you know, strangled, then come to, and then suddenly be like, oh my God, I'm dying. However, if she was being strangled and then, say, was thrown to the ground, head hits the ground really hard, fractured skull, all of a sudden she's hemorrhaging, she can still be grabbing at her throat because she was just strangled, so she's just naturally doing it, like, oh my God, I just got strangled. But then, like, you know, she could be having a hemorrhage in her, you know, she could be essentially losing her mind at that point, and maybe then you can understand her saying, like, I'm dying, because now suddenly it's in relation to something else. I still don't think that's the case. I think that was just part of a convenient story, because again, we don't have any other, like, real suspects, nobody that would want to attack this person in such a way. But, you know, obviously she'd been strangled, but ultimately, when things were said and done, the coroner determined that the death was accidental. This wasn't a cold-blooded murder, and I can understand that, because, you know, it seemed like the police were going to press forward with like, you know, one or both of them got super drunk, things got out of hand, and Jack attacked his wife. However, the initial plans to process forth with a first-degree murder charge were suddenly, you know, knocked askew, because now you have the coroner saying it's an accident, and you have them saying she didn't even die of strangulation. So they ended up having to charge him with manslaughter as an accidental death. Now that doesn't mean that it for absolutely certain was accidental, but I think what they were thinking was, you know, they were probably both drunk, they started to quarrel, both were kind of, you know, didn't have any control over themselves. Jack attacks, and while he's choking her, she tries to pull away, and, you know, I've fallen down drunk. Once you start stumbling and you start going to the ground, you just drop. You don't kind of like stumble, you drop. And the more you've been drinking, the harder you're going to drop to the ground. And a lot of these old rooming houses had, you know, hard wood floors. I could see her falling hard to the ground, skull to the wood, skull fracture, and that caused the brain hemorrhage. However, that doesn't mean... We still can't say for absolute certain that this was accidental, that it was just, like... You know, it was alcohol-induced, but we don't know exactly how drunk Jack necessarily was. The people said he was drunk, but they also said later on he was considerably more drunk. And we don't know for dead certain if Nellie was that drunk at the time. So again, we can't even fully go forward with the story that, you know, the main reason she hit the ground, fractured her skull, was she was so drunk she just went boom to the ground. So there's still questions left unanswered, but I think the fact of the matter is there was reasonable doubt there. They couldn't prove that there was any premeditation here. And so if they went forward with a first-degree murder charge, he probably would have ended up acquitted and released back out onto the streets after brutally attacking his wife. And a little ways down the line, their next-door neighbor, this Kennedy fellow, was more deeply interviewed, because again, he said he heard the screams, he ignored them, but I think what happened was he heard Jack come home. He heard the door to their apartment open, and that maybe sparked his curiosity a little bit more, because he said that he arrived on the scene right after the events occurred. Nellie may have even still been alive, and I'm assuming the door was probably left open. He stepped into the doorway of the Teves home, and he said that he saw both Jack and Nellie were on the ground, and Jack had his arm around her neck. Like, he literally walked in and saw him with his arm wrapped around her neck. So he was probably doing that thing where you go like this and you stick kind of their neck into like the area inside of your elbow, and you can take someone out pretty quick doing that. It was also reported in the newspaper that Kennedy said that, how he came to this conclusion, I'm not certain. I would assume it would be based on what he saw when he walked into the room and he sees Jack Tevis with his arm around Nellie. And apparently, to Kennedy's presumption, the fight was instigated because Nellie wanted to keep drinking and Jack was trying to stop her. He was trying to prevent her from having another drink. No more drinking from you, which is the hallmark of hypocrisy, considering this guy Jack Tevis, who's like one of Portland's greatest alcoholics, it seems. And that had instigated the fight, so I'm guessing she wanted a drink. He said no. She was like, F you, I'm getting a drink anyway. And she goes to get one, and he's enraged by that, grabs her, a scuffle ensues, and then next door neighbor walks in on Jack with his arms wrapped tightly around his wife's neck, and then she's dead a short while later. So I think that's probably why Jack Tevis really fled. I don't think he obviously wasn't going to get a doctor unless he drunkenly thought going to the doctor meant hitting up a few more saloons and getting a few more drinks. I think he looked up, his neighbor standing in the doorway, none of this looks good. He's drunk, but he's maybe got a little bit of his inhibitions left. And he realizes, like, oh, this doesn't look good. So he runs downstairs, yells, oh, somebody help me, make it look like he's innocent. And then, of course, he flees the crime scene. And you're always going to look guilty when you flee the crime scene. Especially when moments before your wife turns up dead, you're seen by a witness choking her. So again, maybe it was accidental, maybe it was at the height of passion, but the fact of the matter is, it doesn't seem like Jack Tevis really cared that much, considering he immediately fled. Not even waiting to see if his wife was actually going to survive or not. Like, what a scumbag. But here, the real scumbags, plural, in addition to Jack Tevis, has to be the trial jury. He finally goes on trial for manslaughter in early 1921. March 21st, 1921. He's acquitted on manslaughter charges, even though he's seen in the room choking his wife. And obviously his actions led to her death. That's exactly what manslaughter is. There's no better definition of it. But they acquitted him. And here's the reason why. So by the jury's logic, And in some ways, it's understandable. Their attitude was, you know, if he's being brought up on manslaughter charges in relation to the assault and battery of his wife, brought on presumably by alcohol mostly, they essentially determined that there was no intent to kill, so they agreed with the accidental verdict, which I can understand. But then they dictated, maybe this is just an example of Portland. Portland, it is what it is now, but Portland was just such a rough and tumble and rugged and just gritty and kind of nasty place to be in a lot of respects. And so it seems like there's these cases I stumble onto where people didn't really seem to have a lot of sympathy for people in certain cases where they really deserve sympathy. They determined that Jack Tevis, which this is interesting because we don't even fully know everything that happened. They said Jack Tevis was fully within his rights to do what he was doing to his wife under the circumstances, which essentially translates to they were both drinking, booze played a large part of it, so those are the circumstances. If he was sober, maybe we would think differently. He was probably trying to do the right thing. He was probably trying to get his wife under control, probably trying to calm her down, but because he was drunk, he accidentally killed her. Still doesn't make it not manslaughter. It wasn't self-defense, I'll tell you that much. And the fact of the matter is, fine, they were drunk. They chose to drink. They chose to put themselves in a position, both of them, where they would be inebriated and their inhibitions would be drastically skewed and distorted. And that could lead, okay, if he was justified in his actions, then you know what? I'm going to go to a bar, 1920s Portland, in my Model T. Were Model Ts? Okay, I'm just going to say Model Ts were around then. I don't know car history that well. I'm going to go to the bar, get nice and drunk, and then I'm going to hop in my Model T and I'm going to drive home because my wife really misses me. And then I hit a passerby on the way home. And you know what? I didn't mean to do it. But under the circumstances, I was drunk and my inhibitions were down and I accidentally hit someone and killed them. So you know what? Drunk driving, hit and run, whatever, let's let me off. That's kind of the logic that these people were going with. It's the darkness of Portland back in the day. So Jack Tevis is one of these classic stories out of Portland where he's a guy that got away with it. He was acquitted, and apparently the judge in the case, based on newspaper reports, was very biased in this case, meaning that it seemed like he wanted an acquittal in this case. I don't know why. This guy's just another wandering drunk. Maybe they knew each other, I don't know. But somehow this guy got away with choking his wife almost to death and then letting her go when she fell to the ground, or possibly throwing her to the ground and fracturing her skull. And he walked out of the courthouse just a couple months later. Probably drank himself to death over time. That's what I'm guessing happened with this guy. So anyway, that's the story with not much justice of the murder of Nellie Tevis that happened 2nd and Market, which would be just a little ways this way from where I am now. Because I'm over at the Lovejoy Fountain now as I meander. So thank you so much for watching this episode. Remember, as always, to like, share, subscribe. And until next time, from the vicinity of the Lovejoy Fountain in southwest Portland, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian, and I'll see you next time.